Hello and welcome to South Africa on 99.94 Cricket Every Day. I'm Neil Manthorpe, one half of the South African team. Lungani Zama is my co-host. South Africa on 99.94 is your new home for South African content. We'll be dropping into your podcast feed on YouTube or the 99.94 app several times every week. So please rate, review and subscribe. And breaking news, if you get a chance, go and check out the Mitch Johnson Show. Former Aussie Quick talks about his life and cricket. You can find it wherever you listen to your podcasts or on YouTube. So thanks for joining Cricket's conversation. Lungani and I are going to take a little trip down memory lane in the hope that history won't repeat itself. But as we all know, South Africa's World Cup, T20 World Cup, got off to a very damp start against Zimbabwe. And it reminded us and several 100,000 other South Africans in South Africa and around the world of South Africa's wet relationship with World Cups. 3 times in particular. We're hoping that South Africa will manage to negotiate their way past the rained-off game against Zimbabwe and still make it to the semi-finals. But 3 times rain has materially affected South Africa's fate at World Cups, 1991 being the one that people who are old enough will remember most. 2003 was certainly one of the 2 most traumatic days of my career in cricket. And then 2015, the semi-final, which again was materially affected by rain at Eden Park in Auckland. Zam, let's start with 91 then. Where were you and how well do you remember it? How old were you actually?
I was 6 years old. I was in a township just outside Maritzburg. And to be honest, I didn't actually know a lot about cricket, but I do remember very clearly. We used to watch the news as a family and you'd wait for the sport because it would come just before the weather. But you would wait for the sport because primarily you were looking to see what teams had done or what had been said about your favorite football team. But I do remember that day it started with the news broadcast actually started with South Africa being knocked out of the World Cup because of rain, and there was just this image of Brian McMillan looking completely helpless and an equation that just didn't make sense. And I mean, no one really followed cricket in my family at the time, but I do remember that this image of this massive hulking guy who just so despondent. I think that final ball that was bowled and he sort of patted back and tucked his bat under his arm and just walked away, just depressed. I remember it clearly, and I was like, oh, well, it doesn't look like he was even trying at the end. And then obviously you go back when you understand a bit more and you go, oh, no wonder he did that because it was completely helpless. Like there's absolutely nothing he could have done. It's just rotten luck. And yeah, but I do remember that image of the news broadcast starting with South Africa out of the World Cup in Australia and not understanding why the sport had come before the news for once.
Those listeners and viewers.
Where were you?
I was in Joburg and I was doing commentary off the TV. You may remember that back then there was a premium rate telephone service where I think people were charged. It was an astronomical fee. I think people were paying like R1 a minute to listen to commentary on the telephone. So I was commentating as if it was radio off the TV, and the reception was terrible. It looked like it was snowing in Sydney. And we could barely make out the pictures, but I was doing my best. And to be honest, it was very difficult as well to get sufficient information. It was a fairly new rain rule that had been introduced actually just before the World Cup. And what happened is, in the event that rain came, you lost an over. You lost the least expensive over from the previous innings, if that makes sense. So in other words, the maidens would be taken off, and then an over with 1 or 2 runs off would be taken off. So that's the way you lost overs. So that's why at one point South Africa, the scoreboard showed So first of all, it showed 23 runs off 13 balls, and then they realised that they'd calculated it wrong, and that's why it changed to 22 runs off 13 balls, and that's why it then went to 22 runs off 7 balls, and then by the time they got back on, because it was only a 10-minute break, the scoreboard, that's why it had 22 runs off 1 ball. Brian McMillan. Do you remember Peter Kirsten in tears as well? The great Kersey. Steve Chouette was there, the sports minister. So it was a strong sort of sense of disconnect for me. And let's be honest, the team only got an invite at the last minute, and they seriously overperformed. I mean, they exceeded everyone's expectations, including their own. I mean, they were accountants and estate agents and butchers and bakers. They weren't really seriously professional, and lawyers. Don't forget, Dave Richardson was at the other end. Brian McMillan. And the other thing I'd like to say now, in on reflection, is that 22 runs off 13 balls back then was today's equivalent of 32 off 13, I reckon. I mean, there was no sense. At no point did you think, oh, we got this in the bag. 22 runs off, there were no, there was no ramping or reverse sweeping. It was, you played each ball on its merits, and if the bowler bowled you a decent Yorker, you dug it out and said, well done. So there was no, I mean, that to me wasn't really traumatic. And I remember just sort of walking out the studio at the end of it thinking, wow, we had a pretty good run. Fancy that. We made it to the semi-finals.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote that book with Mike Proctor, and we spent a lot of time, because he was team manager, talking about the emotions in that dressing room. And yes, there was disappointment, but there was relief almost at just how well South Africa had performed and how excited they were for the next and the next as they were learning. But yeah, it definitely wasn't the heartbreak of, well, not even the heartbreak. It was the sheer embarrassment of 2003, where you're hosting and your mathematics just desperately lets you down on such a public forum. It was.
Okay, all right.
I was
hang
at
on.
Kingsmead.
We'll do that in part 2, because I need I need another drink of my coffee to settle my nerves. We're moving on to 2003. We'll take a short break.
You're listening to Cricket's Conversation on 99.94. Whatever your team, we have the show for you on podcast, YouTube, or on the 99.94 app. We have India, England, South Africa, West Indies, and now Sri Lanka covered. If you want to find us, the best way is to follow us on social media at 9994DM by downloading the 9994 app or Google 99.94 on podcast. We speak cricket.
All right, come on then. I'll let you talk us through it. I'm getting goosebumps just remembering 2003. Go on.
So we were in the academy at that time at Kingsmead. So one of the perks of being in the academy was that in the build-up to games in Maritzburg and Durban, you would be sort of a net bowler, and then a couple of you would either, be dressing room attendants. So you were in and around, sort of helping out the ICC where you could. Or if you did nothing official on the day of the match, you'd get a ticket to the game. So we had tickets to the game, and we were watching and kind of trying to figure out how this thing was unraveling. And obviously the stump mic was fully on as Kuma Sangakkara spoke so eloquently to Sean Pollock about just what he was doing and how he stuffed up the World Cup on such a public stage. And I mean, you just couldn't believe it, because at that stage you understand exactly what's going on cricket-wise. You've kind of read the rules, and the commentators are talking you through it, and they're saying that don't forget the +1. Don't forget the +1. There's the target, which is the par, but you're not trying to par the match, you're trying to win the match. So you've always got to add the 1. And, who knows what happens in those final throes of realizing that you're about to be chucked out of a tournament that you're supposed to be hosting, that's supposed to heal the wounds of the 1999 World Cup, trauma, because half your team was there. You shouldn't lose to Sri Lanka at that point, who, with all respect, had been world champions before, but on such foreign soil, they weren't expected to be as big a factor. Everything is set up. Even after losing to West Indies in the opening game, you kind of felt, okay, South Africa are back on the up. They're going to recover their composure. They've got their bad performance out the way early. And then the later and later it went, the chase looked more and more difficult, and the spinners just spun a web. And it's an amazing thing to watch pressure affect elite sportsmen, because things that look easy 99% of the time suddenly look impossible. And there were silly shots, but it was just this commentary that Kumar Sangakkara was giving in the background that you knew, because you started playing in cricket and you know what people can do when they're in your ear the whole time and you're trying to concentrate on a task. And you could see Mark Boucher getting more and more agitated. You can see Pollock in the dressing room, head in his hands, and this real sense of disbelief that this is really happening.
It was. See, it wasn't a moment, because it was that long, protracted 2 hours that we waited while the drizzle failed to clear. Just for the sake of listeners and viewers who don't remember the exact details, we're still in the group stages. South Africa is hosting its own World Cup. We're still in the group stages. They've got themselves into a bit of a pickle. A couple of, there were a couple of teams didn't travel to Zimbabwe and to Kenya, to Nairobi to play. They forfeited points. So, there was the groups weren't configuring quite in the way that we expected them to. You remember that year that Kenya actually reached the semi-finals extraordinarily. But anyway, so South Africa in this situation, Sri Lanka made a very decent score, wasn't it? About 260. I haven't got the scorecard in front of me. South Africa get into a bit of trouble with the chase. It rains. The target is reduced. Anyway, so they end up, Mark Boucher's on strike, and they need 10 or 11 off what we felt would be the last over, not necessarily of the match, but before they went off for rain. They were trying to obviously finish this over, and the Duckworth-Lewis method had only just been introduced. And here's a crucial piece of information that people forget. It wasn't on the scoreboard. The DLS, the Duckworth-Lewis score target wasn't on the scoreboard. The scoreboards hadn't been configured to include that, which is why 12th man Nicky Boyer was trying to run onto the field. The umpires were shooing him off. Nicky Boyer was trying to run onto the field with a sheet of paper, do you remember, with the Duckworth-Lewis score on it, in order to tell Mark Boucher what it was. And the umpires shoot him off. Steve Buckner, I think, was one of them. And he shooed him off, said, we need to finish this over. And he somehow the pass score target was relayed to Boucher. So he had that number in his mind. And I think Boyer was trying to say, +1. And the umpires shoot him off. And he hit Matthias Muralitharan for 6 in that over, the penultimate delivery. And then, in the belief that he had reached the Duckworth-Lewis score, not victory, because we all expected the rain to clear away. And if you remember, Eric Simons was the head coach, and he had a team discussion before the game even started. So, right, there's rain around. How do we want to play this? And he took the advice of Lance Klusner, who obviously not only lived in Durban at the time, but was a fisherman. And fishermen always know the weather. This was Eric's view. And so Lance said, it won't set in. It definitely won't set in. It'll be squally, but we'll get back on. There won't be long delays. And so Eric said, okay, right, we'll go with that then. So Boucher hit Muralitharan for 6. And then as he's coming to the bowl, the last ball, South Africa need 1 run. again, the way the groups were configured is that not only would that get them into the Super Six, but they would carry the points from the group stage with them into the Super Six, which meant they were all but guaranteed a place in the semi-final. So it was a place in the semi-final at stake, not just a place in the Super Six. Boucher, in the belief that the Six had got South Africa to the target, blocked the last ball. The umpires then said, right, the rain's too heavy, let's go off and wait for it to clear. So off they all walked. There was no sense that anybody had won, or because we all expected to come back on. And then we sat. And then we sat. And then the news came from the umpires that overs were being lost now. We'd lost that the grace period of time. And then we started counting the overs down. And then the news came that the cutoff for the game to finish was at 10:28 p.m. And then it turned to 10 o'clock, and then it was 10:05, and then it was 10:10. And at some point, at various different points, it dawned on all of us that we could actually go out of the World Cup. And then it happened.
It was a proper slow burn, but I think I just remember Klusner making one of like 10 balls or something because there was time. Everybody played with this comfort of there's so much more time. I mean, Marvin Atapatu made 100 in the day, and it was a beautiful innings, but no one was worried because it was, oh no, well, 260, whatever it was, we're chasing. We'll chase that down. It's a good batting pitch. Chasing at night, Kingsmead, it's great. The balls are going to be wet. Their spinners are not going to be effective. There was no sense. Sounds a bit like the script of the Titanic, where you just think, oh no, it's an unsinkable ship, and then suddenly, oh goodness, we need lifeboats. And obviously, Sean Pollock looked like literally Captain Smith or whatever his name is, sitting on top of the tower, just in shock that his ship is sinking so publicly. It was humiliating. It was embarrassing, deeply embarrassing.
All right, enough of that. We'll take a short break and talk 2015 after this.
If you love the language of cricket and want more, then head over to the 99.94 app and you can hear all of our podcasts and cricket commentary. We're adding new shows all the time and covering cricket series from all over the world. Be the first to hear all of our announcements by following us on social media at 9994DM. Welcome to Cricket's Conversation.
Okay, we've put 2003 behind us. South Africa failed to get out of the group stage in their home World Cup. And on to 2015. Finally, a semi-final. It's against New Zealand at Eden Park. And everything appears to be going very, very well. South Africa are taking advantage of the short boundaries on one of the great rugby grounds in the world. Faf du Plessis going well, AB de Villiers. And they were... It's interesting, actually. I'll give a gratuitous plug for Faf du Plessis' biography. It's very good, by the way. But in that book, he says we were well on course for 400. I think that the sands of time have created a bit of hyperbole there in Faf's memory. I don't recall them ever being on course for 400. But we're definitely thinking, 370 is on the cards. We're thinking AB de Villiers and Faf himself had been very meticulous.
And Dave Miller. And
David Miller, yes, of course, that's right. Perhaps he's right. I mean, who am I to question Faf? Maybe they did think they could get 400. But anyway, 370, 375 was well on the cards. And then it rained, and it rained heavily, and all the plans were changed. They ended up with a decent score, but they could and possibly would have put a score on the board which would have, been virtually unchaseable.
Which ended up on 281 for three, I think it was, after 43 overs. But you had the world's best batsman at that time in AB de Villiers on 65 not out from 45 balls and only looking like he was just getting into fourth and fifth gear. because before that, Miller he had this short arm jab, which was drilling the ball sort of like a Tiger Woods hits a stinger in golf. And he was drilling it for six with such ease. The crowd had gone quiet because they could see, okay, the form team in the game is going to go to Australia and play Australia in a World Cup final. We've had a great ride. We've had some good nights at Eden Park. But the South African team just looks like it's steamrolling. I mean, AB, Faf saying they felt 400 was on. Actually, when you think about it logically, on such a small ground straight, and the way that AB was hitting the ball, completely possible. If they'd faced 50 overs, who knows what they could have scored, because New Zealand couldn't bowl to Miller and AB for a spell. The ball just kept on disappearing. I mean, Faf batted well, but he made like 80 off 100. So it wasn't as if he was shooting the lights out. But as soon as he got out and Miller and AB got together, everything looked possible for South Africa. And I remember watching and thinking, I cannot remember a World Cup semi-final performance this clinical. This is the time. This is the team. And I was having FOMO because long before the tournament started, we had a choice whether you wanted to put your name in the hat to go to the World Cup or to go to India at the end of the year. And I'd said India because I was actually petrified of dealing with the trauma of covering another tournament failure. I said, no, I'll go to India. And then I'm sitting there going, you absolute idiot. South Africa's about to pull off this wonderful win and then go to the grand final against Australia, beat Australia on home soil to win the World Cup for the first time, and you've chosen to go to India for 2 months at the end of the year. Because it looked that clinical, that clean. I mean, it was early morning. I think I even dropped my son at school, came back. It's a cruise. This is wonderful. Like, there's no stress. And then the rain came, and then, all the old ghosts start coming back because you think, surely not. They'll come back soon enough. They came back, but straight away, as soon as they walked off the field, you knew the momentum that they had. McCullum and the boys would regroup, remind themselves what they're playing for. The crowd could sort of take a breath and go, whew. Because I think when the ball's flying around like that, you kind of get stuck in a trance and you're just bowling and you're just putting it on a plate. And Miller's hitting it further and further and further. There's nothing worse than a break because it breaks the concentration and the rhythm. And as well as they finished, that truncated innings cost them and gave New Zealand hope to start in a similar vein, because obviously it was a great batting pitch. But it was just miserable to just see so much potential sort of wither away suddenly. And then in the back of your mind, you're thinking, if only we could have finished the innings, South Africa would have been out of sight. Because McCullum, as crazily as he played at the beginning, he played because it sort of felt attainable. It wasn't so far out that he was just having to close his eyes and swing for the hills. He could actually play a bit methodical and take a leaf out of Miller and AB's book and say, it's that good a pitch. If you just hit through the line, there's enough runs to be made. The ground is small enough. And it just needed that start. And suddenly the crowd was up and thinking, we're going to pull off an absolute miracle here. And they need us. And, that volume surge, it was one of the greatest games of cricket that I think we'll ever see.
I was commentating, and when you're behind the microphone, you just got to describe the action. You sort of get disassociated emotionally from the result and everything that's happened before. But there was a commentary change, but with the 5 overs to go, and that's when I was sitting up. Was standing up in the rafters of the grandstand where the commentary boxes are, with the other commentators who were off air, and that's when, the swing of emotion from despair to elation was happening every 2 balls. It was incredible. It was Brendan McCullum's assault and that run chase that got New Zealand off to such an astonishing flyer. And, just rewinding, before the game even started, I was down on the field and there was just a really, really strange atmosphere in the South African team. And that's when I spoke to Sean Pollock, who was also commentating for TV. and he said um, they've changed the team. Vernon Fernandez playing ahead of Kyle Abbott, and Faf deals with that in his book, and he says that it was extremely traumatic and upsetting, but that he doesn't use it as an excuse at all. He says, we had our chances in the game, we fluffed our lines, but yeah, I mean, rain materially changed that game, didn't it? And I don't think I think it's fair to say that the Duckworth Lewis recalculations at that stage were still a little bit sort of behind reality, weren't they? I mean, it didn't take into account sufficiently. I mean, South Africa lost 7 overs, and I think that translated to something like 25 runs or something. It didn't reflect the dominance of that first innings at all.
This was a team, and in particular, this was AB de Villiers at the peak of his powers. He just scored that crazy 100 off 31 balls on Pink Day. He'd done what he'd done to New Zealand early in the tournament at Sydney. To West Indies early in the tournament at Sydney, one of the great one-day innings. So I don't think there's a maths calculation that can sufficiently equate what AB could achieve at that time. Once he was in, there was just he could literally hit the best bowler in the world for 6 sixes in a row and make it look easy, especially on a ground that small. So for all the calculations, whatever they added, in South Africa's dressing room, it felt like they were shortchanged because AB never finished the innings. And this is after, like you say, they woke up to this disappointment or this conflict, full-on conflict of a team has been changed for this reason. It is a uniquely South African problem. They've overcome that hurdle. They've combined together as a team, and they've put up that batting performance to say, okay, we're actually going to take as much of the result away from the bowlers as possible because our star death bowler is not playing anymore, but that's fine. We'll win it with the bat and make sure that we give the bowlers enough to defend. And they've charged like absolute trains. And yeah, there's you can't. I mean, the way that AB at that Pink Day, that's the starkest example of you cannot put a lid on genius. And unfortunately, maths equations, put everyone into the same box and say, well, historically, people scored this much at this time. Historically, you hadn't seen a machine like AB playing, as captain of that team, knowing that this was their moment, this was their time, and he was the guy to do it. I've spoken to him since. He's never, ever fully recovered from the trauma of that day because everything looked like the stars had aligned. Standing in the middle, there was serenity, which is uncommon to South Africans. But he felt it was time. I've practiced this. I've played this movie out in my head. I've made runs. I've sort of got into turbocharge where people can't touch me. People can't bowl to me. Like it's not an arrogance. It was a reality. You could see fear in the eyes of the best bowlers in the world, not just in the IPL, but in international matches. He'd seen it. And he knew that look and he knew that feeling. He was absolutely certain that if he batted 7 overs, South Africa would have been out of sight. And I don't think anyone can argue that. You take that away and then the absolute cliffhanger with, of course, a fellow South African hitting the winning runs is
Grant Elliott.
the ultimate body blow. I mean, it's not fun to see, anyone cry at the end of a cricket of a sporting match, of any nature, because it's sport. But I think, you speak to any one of those players, even now, when they see images of 2015 World Cup semi-final and they sort of, peel the mind back to exactly what they felt at that time. Like Morne, Morkel, sobbing like a baby. Faf, AB, all of them. It's not something that you ever get over because you put in so much and you thought with so much certainty that this is your time. And it's a combination of factors, even some of them own goals. It's a combination of factors that have just taken it away. And it feels like, the ultimate conspiracy theory. World cricket will just dangle this carrot, and the closer you get, the more it's going to hurt. And I don't know if it's possible for a World Cup loss to hurt more than that, because it just felt like everything was in place.
And finally, the consolation is that we had a damn good tour of India.
Well, look, by the time India came around, I think by the end I was speaking Hindi. I was ordering Ubers like a local. I had the absolute time of my life. And actually, to have had to witness that in person, if I'd gone to New Zealand, I don't know. You might have started sobbing like one of the cricketers yourself, and just don't know how you cover the match at that point because we're professionals and we cover these events, but you're South African, like we keep saying, like you you can wear your neutral hat all you want, but after all the trauma that South Africa suffered on the cricket field, if you care about cricket and you played the game and you had hopes of playing the game at any level and seeing South Africa win something, when it gets that close on such a massive stage, you can't not hurt. You can't not feel for players that you know personally and you know that their dreams were building up to that moment, and to be crushed so violently by just a tsunami of events over that 24 hours. It's trauma. So India was definitely eat, pray, love. I mean, there was rain there too. There was rain at AB's 100th test there, but we couldn't give two stuffs because we're just swanning around, sampling donuts in Bangalore's main road. And it was a world away from the trauma of the World Cup. But it hurts. It hurts to this day for anybody who cares about South African cricket because it felt like 2015 was the time. I mean, they cut a music video, for crying out loud, for Protea Fire. I mean, that team had all the ingredients. They had a bigger wave of national optimism around them when they left. I remember the send-off at Rosebank. It felt like it was time. It felt like it was time for so many, and to have to come back with that trauma added onto 99 and added onto 91, and it just feels like this vicious cycle of World Cup pain.
Well, there's a belief in the cricket world that South Africa have to win one day. Anyway, that's enough for now. That's our little trip down memory lane. Thank you for listening to South Africa on 99.94, where we speak cricket every day. Please rate, review, and subscribe wherever you enjoy your podcasts. You can download the 99.94 app and follow us on Twitter at Neil Manthorpe, and at Whamzam17. Zams, thank you very much. Till next time.